back after the Easter break for our today's LCAP lecture. And it's a great honor and pleasure for me to welcome Dr. Laura Castelli, now from the University of Cambridge. Yes, they can see you and they will be able to hear you. She's now a professor at Cambridge. Before that, she was at LMU in Munich. She's known for a lot of works, so I'll only refer to some of the books. For instance, there is her well-known commentary on book Iota of the Metaphysics of Aristotle. Then she has been translating and is still translating, if I'm not mistaken, several volumes in the Ancient Commentators on Aristotle series, more specifically from Alexander's commentary on the topics. Then there's also a monograph on problems and paradigms of unity, 2010, that may have been your first monograph. Yeah. So a very prolific, very well-known scholar who produces work of the highest quality, and that's why we are so happy to have her here today. And she will talk today on Aristotle, on disentangling matter and place, some thoughts on Plato in Physics, Book 4, Chapter 2. So please, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much, first of all, for this way too generous introduction and also for this very kind invitation. So now I'm standing because I fear that if I sit down, you will not see me. So there will be this sort of, when I stand, I'm usually delivering lectures, but this is not meant to be a lecture. So actually, what I would like to do today is to submit to you some considerations about one particular text, really. But before approaching the text, I would like to tell you a little bit more about the context of this project. So I am currently working on a project on Aristotle as a reader of Plato's dialogue. And in particular, I'm interested in Aristotle as a reader of Plato's middle and late dialogues. Now, someone asked me to write a review article on Aristotle's reception of the Timaeus. I think they asked me because they want to see the end of me. But the moment I started to work on this, I realized that I may not be able to write that as an article. But I mean, luckily, there are other occasions in which I can break down this project, and this is one of the things that I'm going to do today. So, in fact, I think that for each single passage in which Aristotle even explicitly mentions the Timaeus, one could go on and write one more or less long article. So today I'm really just narrowing down the focus and the attention to one specific passage. So you should have a handout. And the passage I'm going to basically comment upon is your text 1, which I'm going to read out. So this is a passage from Book 4 of the Physics, Chapter 2. These are the chapters where Aristotle is discussing the notion of topos, of place. And here is the passage basically I'm going to comment upon for the whole time. For this reason, Plato too, in the Timaeus, says that matter and space are the same thing. Here I translate Cora with space. You can use whatever translation you like. And here, this is still part of the infinitive. So he also says that, what is capable of participating, to metaleptikon, and space are one and the same thing. And while he speaks of what is capable of participating in different ways there and in the so-called unwritten doctrines, nonetheless, he said that place and space are the same thing. For everybody says that place is something, but he is the only one who made an attempt at saying what it is. So of course you read this and I suppose the first reaction, which is also the reaction that you find in many commentaries, Plato never talks about Ule. Plato never even uses the word metaleptikon in the Timaeus. So this is a very clear case, you know, in which Aristotle is misrepresenting, deliberately misrepresenting Plato's doctrine. Now, I would like to say up front that, you know, I'm not really interested in defending Plato or Aristotle. I don't think they need my defense. But I think that there is a more constructive way of looking at Aristotle's criticism of Plato. And in any case, this is the way I approach his criticism. So I take it that Aristotle is somehow taking seriously the lessons from the first part of the Parmenides. So in the first part of the Parmenides, the old Parmenides, you know, is raising criticism against the doctrine of forms that Socrates is submitting. And what is, I mean, maybe none of those arguments are going to be knockdown arguments for someone who's really committed to the theory of form. But the point is, if you have, you know, a very, a belief, a strong belief, and you cannot defend it against criticism, it doesn't matter whether the criticism is fair or unfair. It doesn't matter whether the criticism is such that, you know, is going to entirely undermine your views. Well, the problem is yours because you have beliefs that you cannot defend. And in a way, I think that this is also one lesson that Aristotle learns. And I also believe that often when he brings in Plato, as in this case, he's not so much interested, you know, in finding an occasion to voice his disagreement with Plato. Maybe that too. I mean, we will never find out since we do not have access to Aristotle's mind. But more importantly and more interestingly, he is bringing in Plato, at least in this particular case, because he explicitly says Plato is the only one who said something about this. And he wants to point out that in the way in which Plato approaches what Aristotle sees as the problem of defining what topos is, Plato, in a way, manifests one problem. And this is what I'm going to talk about in the rest of my talk. So, first of all, a little bit of context. So the dio at the beginning of the passage is what I'm going to spell out. But before spelling out the dio, there are a couple of things I want to point out in this text. So the last two lines, Plato is the only one who made an attempt at saying what place is. Now, to give you a little bit of context, earlier on, Aristotle has introduced the inquiry into place by saying, and this is your text too, the issue of what place is presents several difficulties, for it does not appear to be the same thing. Theorousi exapanton tonu parchonton. This is a bit of a difficult phrase, I think, to translate. If one considers the issue starting from all things that obtain. And I think what Aristotle means there is that, you know, even if we consider all what seem to be uncontroversial features of place, depending on what of this feature we emphasize, we may end up with different accounts of places. And this is one of the puzzling aspects of places. Furthermore, Aristotle says we do not have from other people any formal formulation of the difficulties, nor any formal solution of the difficulties about it. So actually he is praising Plato for having tried to do something that nobody else had done before. Now, one important thing in this passage, so Aristotle explicitly distinguishes between something that Plato said in the Timaeus and something that he said in the unwritten doctrine. And more specifically, he distinguishes two different accounts of to metaleptikon, so of what is capable of participating. Now, the two different accounts that he has in mind become clear later in the chapter, and this is your text 10. So in the case of the Timaeus, Aristotle says, again, he's talking about matter, whereas in the unwritten doctrine, what is capable of participating is the great and the small. Now, how are we supposed to understand this distinction that Aristotle is drawing, provided that Plato doesn't really talk in terms of matter? So what I'm going to suggest is that Aristotle takes the Timaeus to be an example, to be a text in which Plato is giving a sort of Pythagorean version of his own theory. And what I mean by Pythagorean is that Aristotle explicitly says at different places, one text I have given you, it is your text 9, at the end of your text 9. There are other texts, and specifically Metaphysics Alpha 6, if you want to look this up, 987b 2527. So there Aristotle says that Plato followed the Pythagoreans in assuming to aperon as a principle, but it was idion, it was specific to Plato that he split up the aperon into two. So while the Pythagorean thought of the aperon just as one principle. So one thing that I believe Aristotle has in mind here is that, the chora is not presenting the sort of duality that the dyad of the great and the small is supposed to capture. So in this sense, the account of the metaleptikon in the Timaeus is different from the account in the written doctrine, even if, according to Aristotle, the function, the metaphysical function of the metaleptikon in the two cases is going to be similar. Now, let's try to see how Aristotle gets to the point of ascribing to Plato a view about matter. And in order to do this, I'm just going to say something about the immediately preceding lines of T1, and this is your T3. So the difficulty, and this is why, this is the place where I think it emerges that Aristotle is interested in discussing Plato's views, because Plato's views represent, in a way, one particular way to approach the notion of place, but also manifests a radical difficulty in capturing what place is. And the radical difficulty is that, as a matter of fact, if we just look at appearances, there is no way for us to distinguish, based on what we see from the phenomenological point of view, matter from place, because they are, exactly there. So there is no way for us to point at something and say, this is matter and this is the place. They occupy, so to speak, exactly the same phenomenological space. So the challenge is for Aristotle to find a way to disentangle these two notions. But what will be more important for my purposes today is to explain why Aristotle thinks that he has to draw a distinction where Plato probably didn't feel the need to draw any such distinction. So let me start with the context and the difficulty. So the context, I'm going to read out text 3. If indeed place is the first containing or surrounding thing of each body, it would turn out to be a certain limit, so that it could seem that the place is, sorry, there is a typo in the hand, not if, but is. It could seem that the place is the form and the shape of each thing, by which the magnitude, i.e. the matter of the magnitude, is determined. For this is the limit of each thing. For those who look at things in this way, then, the place is the form of each thing. And now comes the important bit. But insofar as the place seems to be the interval of the magnitude, the place turns out to be the matter. For this is other than the magnitude, and this is what is contained by the form, what is determined, for example, by the surface and the limit. And matter, and here I translate the chi as i.e., the indefinite, is such a thing. For when the limit and the affections of the sphere are removed, what is left is nothing beyond matter. And at this point, then your text 1 comes in. So for this reason, then Plato, blah, blah, blah. So Aristotle is introducing, the concept really of matter in a way that is characteristic of his own way of thinking about matter. And on the handout, if you look at text 4, this is a famous passage from Metaphysics 7.3, where Aristotle is suggesting that, if we think of ousia as the hypokeimenon, then we will have to say that ousia is matter. And the way in which he proceeds, the way in which he captures, this intuition of what matter actually, of how matter can be talked about, is very much reminiscent of the passage in Physics 2. Sorry, in Physics 4.2. There you have, by the way, at line 12 in text 4, the language of upomenon, not just of upokeimenon and upomenon. And this is interesting because upomenon comes up in the Timaeus 2 at 49e2. And later at line 19, you have that matter is to horizomenon hypotouton, is what is determined, is what is defined, by length and breadth and depth. And this is also similar to what you find in your text 3. In line 8, you have the horismenon. So this is Aristotle talking about his concept of matter. And what he's basically saying is that, provided that this sort of thing, this entirely indefinite thing which is left is matter. So if we think along this line, it turns out that Plato's chora is a sort of matter, and that the chora is also identified by Plato with place. So it turns out that according to Plato, place is the same as matter. Now, this of course takes, intermediate steps, but let's think a little bit about what we can say about what Plato does in the Timaeus. So is it wrong to say that Plato uses topos and chora to indicate the same thing? Well, this is a controversial issue, but precisely because it's controversial, there are passages that could suggest that chora and topos are used as equivalent. Is it wrong to say that Plato characterized the chora as what is completely indeterminate? I don't think this is obviously wrong. Is it wrong to say that Plato did not draw any clear distinction between the indeterminate and so this indeterminate something and topos? Again, it's unclear to me that that's wrong. So it is certainly not true that Plato said that hule and chora are the same, but you can see how, if you follow, what Aristotle is saying, he can come up with the view that after all, on the picture that Plato draws in the Timaeus, it looked like the indeterminate and topos actually are the same. Now, we can discuss all of this. There are further issues about the language of metalepticon, and I'm happy to talk more about this later. But now I would like to move on a little bit and see why I think for Aristotle it is important to draw the attention to this perhaps consequence, if you want, of his interpretation of the Timaeus. So I think that the reason why for Aristotle it is important that, you know, once you have the notion of matter clearly in place, and you have, you know, the picture in the Timaeus, you may get the impression that topos and matter are the same thing. So the reason why Aristotle is important, think that it's important to draw attention to that, is that indeed it is difficult to distinguish matter from place. And this is the point that I would like to spell out now. So there is an objective difficulty there. And the objective difficulty I would like to call the co-appearance of matter and space. And the reason why I'm going to reveal the end. So the reason why for Aristotle it is so crucial to distinguish these two notions, and this might indeed be, you know, something genuinely Aristotelian, which is not there in the Timaeus. So the reason is that for Aristotle, drawing a distinction between matter and place is the only way to give an appropriate account of locomotion. And I'm going to say something more about this in the end. But first, about the difficulty to disentangle matter and place. So I am now on text 5 on the handout. So we are still in chapter 2 of book 4. This whole chapter is about the ways in which people may come to identify place with form on the one hand and with matter, or with matter on the other hand. And Aristotle says it is reasonable that to those who look at things starting from these considerations, understanding what place is may seem to be difficult if it is indeed either of these things, namely either matter or form. For this is an issue for the highest speculation in any case, and it is not easy to get to know them, namely form and matter, separately from each other. But importantly, as Aristotle will go on to say, it is also not easy to get to know form, matter, and place separately from each other. So why is it so difficult to disentangle matter and place? And I think that Aristotle, in fact, gives an account of this difficulty, and this is what you find in your text 6. So matter would seem to be place, if indeed what one considered, and I mean here one has to supply something, because if you look at the Greek, you only have a skopoie. I mean, the skopoie what? So one consider this issue in what is at rest and is not separate but continuous. And now here is the crucial bit. And if you look at the Greek, at line 31, you have the hosperga, which is then picked up at line 34 by the hoto kai, or topos, blah, blah. So this is what Aristotle is saying. In the same way in which, if, and here we have a bit of a Menidean problem in the sense that there is no subject there. If something goes through alteration, there is something which is white now and was black before. STT, nun men leukon palaide melan, or something that is hard now and was soft before. For this reason, we say that the matter is something. So the matter is this T, which is now white. So place 2 seems to be, in virtue of such an appearance, uto kaio topos diato iautesti nos einai dokei fantasias. Except that the former, which I take to mean i.e. matter, seems to be because what used to be air is now water, whereas place seems to be, since where there used to be air, there is now water. But matter, as was said in the earlier works, neither is separate from the thing nor contains it, whereas place has both these properties. So this is a difficult text, and there would be many things to say. We can discuss more, but just to give you, the gist of what I would like to say about this text is that in this text, Aristotle basically gives a diagnosis of the difficulty of disentangling matter and place. So if we look at phenomena, if we look at things changing, if we just look at the way in which perceive that, in which we perceive change, there is no way for us, independently of any conceptual framework, to draw the distinction between these two scenarios. So we see exactly the same thing. We see that, there is some change going on in a certain area of our perceptual space. And then how do we account for that? I mean, there is nothing in what we actually see that allows us to draw this distinction between the place where the change is occurring and the thing in which the change is occurring. So what I would like to argue is that in this passage, Aristotle, in a way, gives a diagnosis again of a difficulty. So from the phenomenological point of view, Plato's account in the Timaeus is completely fine. The problem for Aristotle, however, and this is something which becomes clear at other places in the physics, and I give you one passage, which is text 7. So the problem with the Platonic, account of the perception of the way in which change can be perceived is that, according to Aristotle, that doesn't really allow to give a proper explanation, a proper account of locomotion. And, Aristotle goes through a lot of work to explain that everything that changes is a three-dimensional object, has to be an extended object, and so on. But importantly, the way in which Aristotle thinks about locomotion is such that, in order to understand locomotion, we have to see that there is a unified three-dimensional object which we can, in a way, separate from its surroundings. And locomotion is a change of this object with respect to its surroundings. So the place for Aristotle turns out to be the internal limit of the container of the moving object. So when something changes in place, something is changing with respect to the limit of the container. So quite literally, for Aristotle, change in place means change with respect to the surroundings. And this is, I think, is really, one of his priorities in these chapters. So he's very clear that he wants to formulate a notion of topos, which allows him to account for locomotion. And if you look at the way in which he also emphasizes how his account of topos has to be understood in your text 7, I think you can see that in a way this concern is really present to his mind. So here is when he's, coming to a conclusion about what place is. He says, it is necessary that place be the remaining option of the four, i.e. the limit of the containing body along which it is in contact with the contained body. And I call the contained body what can change according to locomotion. Place seems to be something great and hard to grasp, because matter and form co-appear, and because the substitution of the locally moving objects happens in the containing body, which is at rest. For it may appear that there be some intermediate interval other than the magnitudes that are in motion. Okay, this is complicated because here Aristotle is saying, you know, in the very same portion of our perceptual space, we have an object that is changing, and there we have a place, matter, form, and we may also get the impression that there is, you know, a space, a distance that that object, sorry, occupies. This is something that Aristotle is going to tackle when he discusses the notion of void. This is not one of my main concerns, but I think here again, one of the things I want to emphasize is that he really feels the need when he expresses his own understanding of place to tie that definition of place to his understanding of the periekomenon, of the thing which is in a place, as something which is kineton kata phoran. I'm going to skip text 8. So text 8 is a text that you find at the very beginning of the inquiry of place, and the reason why I put it there is that it gives you the sort of what I think Aristotle takes as the neutral description of phenomena based on which people tend to believe that place exists. Maybe I don't skip it, just let me read it. So that place exists seemed to be clear from mutual replacement. For where there is water now, once this gets out, as if from a vase, then there is air there. And at some other time, some other body occupies this same place. And this latter, namely place, indeed seems to be different from all things that come to be in it and change. For in that in which there is air now, in that thing there was water before. So that it is clear that place and space, hora, into which and from which they changed, were something different from both, namely from both air and water. Now, here I think that Aristotle is giving what he takes to be a sort of neutral account of the phenomena. Now, pay attention in line 6. En ho aer esti nun udor en tuto proteron e. Now, his, final account of this phenomenon is going to be that en ho has to be understood in the sense of in the place in which. But in this formulation, I think Aristotle still leaves, in a way, open the possibility that we understand en ho in another way, or at least it leaves open the possibility that we understand place in a different way from the way in which I understand place. So this account would be true even if en ho, captured the notion of place as matter. So to sum up what I wanted to say up to now, we saw there is this difficult passage in 4.2 where Aristotle seems to be ascribing to Plato a view about matter. I gave an account of how Aristotle comes to formulate that point about Plato in the way in which he does. I also said something about why I think that Aristotle finds it important to mention Plato here. And I repeat, I don't think it is just for polemical reasons. It is, first of all, because he says Plato was the only one to say something about place, but also because Plato's approach to place, in a way, manifests an essential difficulty, a difficulty that has to be clearly formulated in order to be solved. And the difficulty is that place and matter appear there exactly, in the same perceptual space. The last point that I wanted to draw to your attention is another passage. This is your passage 11. Now, this is still from book 4 of the physics, but it is from chapter 6, which is now not anymore about topos, but is about tokenon, so about the void. And there is what I find a very puzzling bunch of lines. These are lines 11 to 16 in this text. And I would like to see if we can get a better sense of whom and what Aristotle is talking about in those lines. And I would like to interpret those lines in line of some of the things that I said before. So I'm going to read out the whole passage first. The void, then, appears to be said in one way in the sense of what is not full of body that is perceptible to touch. And what is perceptible to touch is what has weight and lightness. For this reason, one could raise the difficulty of what would they say if the interval had color or sound? Would that be void or not? Or perhaps it is clear that if it admits of tangible body, then it is void. If not, it is not. So, first understanding of void, void is what is not full of tangible body. And then Aristotle goes on to introduce this other rather mysterious understanding of void. In another way, void, he said, is spoken of as that in which there is no determinate this, todity, or determinate corporeal substance, usiatis somaticae. For this reason, some people say that the void is the matter of the body, ten to somatos hulen. Hoiper kaiton topo tauto tutum. The very same people who say that place is this very thing, which I take to mean the matter of the body too. And they say this not speaking well, for matter is not separate from things, whereas they investigate the void as separate. Now, who are these people? Now, I would like to suggest, based on what we just saw, that here perhaps Aristotle still has, a possible consequence of a Platonic view in mind. And the reason why he's phrasing this in terms of void, in terms of canon, which I personally find quite puzzling, is that, as I suggested at the very beginning, he thinks that what we find in the Timaeus is sort of Pythagorean versions of Plato's understanding of the indeterminate. Now, Aristotle thinks that Plato's, in a way, inherits the indeterminate as a principle from the Pythagoreans. He differs from the Pythagoreans in the unwritten doctrines because he, in a way, duplicates the indeterminate. But if in the Timaeus, he sticks, in a way, with the Pythagorean views, then Aristotle may also think that, there is also a Platonic version of the Pythagoreans' views about the void. So he's explicit that the Pythagoreans do admit the canon. He connects the canon with the apeiron. So I wonder whether perhaps one way to understand what he's saying in this last bit of text that I just saw is to say this could be for Aristotle, a development of that reading of that part of Plato's philosophy. I think I stop here. Thank you very much.